What's up guys, it is Mike from Manahoarders. In this video we'll be covering a deck tech for a Grixis commander, Nekusar the Mindrazer. You can cast Nekusar for 2, a blue, a black, and a red. He is a 2/4 zombie wizard. His text reads, at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And whenever an opponent draws a card, Nekusar will deal 1 damage to that player. The final price for this build came in at $176.05. This does include the price of our commander and all of our lands. Now bear in mind, a lot of these prices are going to vary greatly depending on the vendor you use, the quality of the cards you purchase, and a variety of other factors. Before we dive into the deck, let's go over a few key points. First up, I will rate the power level of this specific build at around a 5 out of 10 on the power scale. Now, this is not to say that there aren't some extremely strong cards in this deck. However, I feel power level is greatly dependent upon how early you can win the game and how consistently. Now, as you can tell from the title, I opted to build around an archetype that is not based around wheels, which is most commonly seen when running Nekusar. Now, granted, I think wheels is probably his most powerful archetype, but I feel like it is pretty played out, and I wanted to try something different for this commander. If I had to call this deck anything, I would label it more of a Grixis control. We're going to be running plenty of cards that cause our opponents to pay life whenever they are casting spells, disrupt their game plans, discard cards from their hands, and limit the amount of creatures they are able to attack with on any given turn. Now that that is out of the way, let's check out some of the cards we will be including in the deck. First up are our artifacts. We have Dimir Signet. It's going to help us add a blue and a black to our mana pool. Isolation Cell. Whenever an opponent casts a creature spell, they will either lose 2 life or pay 2 mana. Izzet Signet will tap to add a blue and a red to our mana pool. Mindcrank. Whenever an opponent loses life, that player will put that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Whenever they draw off of Nekusar, they will be losing life. They will be drawing 2 each turn, so they'll have to put 2 cards from the top of their library into their graveyard. Rakdos Signet will add a black and a red to our mana pool. And the OG Soul Ring will tap for 2 colorless mana. Next up are our creatures. Agent of Stromgald. This 1/1 red mana dork will help us turn our red mana into black mana, offering a little bit of mana fixing. For 5 mana, we can cast Archfiend of Depravity. We get a 5/4 Demon with Flying that reads, at the beginning of each opponent's end step, that player chooses up to 2 creatures he or she controls, then sacrifices the rest. This card is utterly backbreaking for decks that want to rely on a lot of tokens or playing a lot of big creatures in hopes to overwhelm the board with sheer force. A new card from M21 that I think is going to get a lot of play, and one that I will likely be including in my Goblin tribal deck, Brash Taunter. This 1/1 Goblin has Indestructible. Whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. And then for 2 and a red, we can tap it so it can fight another creature. So as we said before, if our opponents are playing decks that have lots of big creatures, we can use this card to fight those big creatures, and then use that damage to harm that opponent as sort of punishment for having such a big creature on their board. For 2 red, we can cast Eidolon of the Great Revel. Whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, Eidolon will deal 2 damage to that player. Now, this can harm us, but again, if we're able to get this out early, it can be really punishing to players that want to run a lot of cheap counter magic or intend to rely on running tons of small creatures that they intend to cast early to draw value throughout the game. Now, as I said before, we are not running a wheel-specific archetype, but I did want to include Fate Unraveler. Whenever an opponent draws a card, Fate Unraveler will deal 1 damage to that player. So it's really the same effect that Nekusar has, meaning that if we have this out and our commander, we will be able to deal even more damage anytime our opponent tries to generate some card advantage. For 1 and 2 blue, we can cast Fatespinner. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they will choose draw step, main phase, or combat phase, and then they will skip each instance of the chosen step or phase this turn. Now, this may seem sort of counterintuitive, as our opponents could just skip their draw phase to avoid the penalty from Nekusar. But eventually, they're going to need to draw some cards, meaning they'll have to give up casting spells during their main phase, or give up attacking during their combat phase, which is kind of what we want here. Offering some protection, we have Fogbank. It is a 0/2 wall with Defender and Flying that will prevent all combat damage that will be dealt to it or by it. Also offering some interesting protection is Gomazoa. This 0/3 jellyfish with Defender and Flying we can use to tap and put Gomazoa and each creature it's blocking on top of their owner's libraries, and then those players will shuffle their libraries. So if our opponents have a particularly threatening creature they're going to come after us with, we can block with Gomazoa, tap, and then get rid of it so it'll be shuffled away in their library. And we have Guard Gomazoa. This 1/3 Defender with Flying will prevent all combat damage that will be dealt to it, making it a very solid blocker. For 1 and a red, we can cast Harsh Mentor whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or land on the battlefield that isn't a mana ability. Harsh Mentor will deal 2 damage to that player. And a card with almost the exact same ability, Immolation Shaman. Whenever an opponent activates an ability of artifact, creature, or land that's not a mana ability, Immolation will deal 1 damage to that player, and we can also pay 5 to give it +3/+3 in menace until end of turn. A card that synergizes particularly well with the added card advantage from Nekusar, Irencrag Pyromancer. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, Irencrag Pyromancer deals 3 damage to any target. If we have our commander out, we will be guaranteed to draw 2 cards every single turn, meaning we'll be able to throw 3 damage around if this card is out. For 1 in the blue, we can cast Jushi Apprentice. So before we flip it, it generates some pretty inefficient card draw, but once we have 9 or more cards in our hand, we can flip it, and then we can use it to force target player to draw cards. Now we can also target ourselves to generate some extra card advantage or dig for an answer if needed. Also dealing damage to our opponents when they draw is Kederekt Parasite. For 1 black, whenever an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, Kederekt will deal 1 damage to that player. Psychosis Crawler, one of the better cards that can generate some advantage whenever we are drawing cards. Power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in our hand, and whenever we draw, each opponent will lose a life. Offering some good versatility is Rankle, Master of Pranks. We can get a 3/3 fairy rogue with flying and haste. Whenever he deals combat damage to the player, we can choose any of his abilities. Each player will discard a card, each player will lose a life and then draw a card, or each player will sacrifice a creature. The perfect answer for any deck that relies on life gain. Stigma Lasher. For 2 red, we get a 2/2 Elemental Shaman with Wither, and whenever it deals damage to a player, that player can't gain life for the rest of the game. Offering some good protection as well, for 5 mana we can cast Stuffy Doll. We'll get a 0/1 artifact creature with Indestructible. When it enters, we'll choose a player. Whenever it is dealt damage, it'll deal that much damage to the chosen player. It can also tap to deal 1 damage to itself, thus harming that player every time it does. A fantastic red commander, Torbran, Thane of Redfell. If a red source we control will deal damage to an opponent, or permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. That means Nekusar, normally dealing 1 damage, will now deal 3 damage every time an opponent draws a card. If an opponent is known for ramping way too much out of the gate, this card can deal some much needed damage to them. Tunnel Ignus. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under his or her control this turn, Tunnel Ignus will deal 3 damage to that player. For 2 and 3 black, we can cast Vengeful Pharaoh. We get a 5/4 zombie with a death touch that reads whenever combat damage is dealt to you or a planeswalker you control. If Vengeful Pharaoh is in your graveyard, destroy target attacking creature, then put Vengeful Pharaoh on top of your library. This allows us to recur a 5/4 death touching body that will also destroy creatures if it is in the graveyard. As a way to neutralize some particularly threatening creatures, we have Wall of Stolen Identity. Whenever it enters, it will enter as a copy of any creature on the board, except it has a wall and has a defender. As long as it's on the battlefield, that creature that it copied will be tapped and be unable to untap during its controller's untap step, meaning if someone wanted to attack with a large body or relied on the tap abilities of some particularly strong creatures, we'll be able to take that away from them. For 3 red, we have War Elemental. When it comes into play, we'll have to sacrifice it unless an opponent was dealt damage this turn, and then whenever damage is dealt to an opponent, we'll put that many +1/+1 counters on War Elemental. Now, it seems relatively inefficient, but if we are able to get it out following a good combat step or pinging one of our opponents, this card can get absolutely insane as we go around the board with our commander. We also have Nin the Pain Artist. For blue and a red, we get a 1/1 Vidalcan Wizard. We can pay X, a blue and a red, and tap her to deal X damage to target creature, and then that controller will also draw that many cards. And once again, punishing decks for running a lot of creatures, we have Rampaging Ferocidon. And as Menace, players can't gain life, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield, Rampaging Ferocidon will deal 1 damage to that creature's controller. In total, we are running 12 enchantments in this deck. Now, this may seem like a lot, but some of these are just very good for what we want to do in both controlling the board and damaging our opponents for simply playing the game. First up, we have Burning Earth. This will also hurt us, but whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, Burning Earth will deal 1 damage to that player. And a new card from M21, one that is highly talked about and I think was absolutely perfect for this commander in particular, is Fiery Emancipation. For 3 and 3 red, we get this red enchantment. If a source you control will deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. Absolutely bonkers with this commander. Helping us greatly slow down our opponents is Frozen Aether. For 3 and a blue, artifacts, creatures, and lands your opponent's control come into play tapped. An absolute headache for monocolored decks is Mana Maze. For 1 and a blue, we get an enchantment that reads, players can't cast spells that share a color with the spell last played this turn. For 1 a black and a red, we can cast Pain Magnification. Whenever an opponent is dealt 3 or more damage by a single source, that player will discard a card. For 5, we can cast Painful Quandary. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, they will have to lose 5 life or discard a card. Similar to Eidolon of the Great Revel, for 1 and a red, we can cast Pyrostatic Pillar. Whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, Pillar will deal 2 damage to that player. For 2 and a blue, we can cast Soul Barrier. The Oracle text reads, whenever an opponent casts a creature spell, Soul Barrier will deal 2 damage to that player unless they pay 2 mana. We also have Spiteful Visions for 4. At the beginning of each player's draw step, they'll draw an additional card, and when they do, Spiteful Visions will deal 1 damage to that player. A fairly expensive card, but one that I felt fit the theme of control, is Stranglehold. For 3 and a red. Your opponents can't search their libraries, and if they would begin an extra turn, they skip that turn instead. For 3 black, we have Underworld Dreams. Whenever an opponent draws a card, Underworld Dreams will deal 1 damage to that player. And for 4, we can cast War's Toll. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, they will tap all of their lands, and if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures they control attack if able. Now let's take a look at our instance. First up is Arcane Denial. For 1 in the blue, we can counter target spell. Its controller can draw 2 cards at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, and then we can draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. Dream Fracture. For 1 and 2 blue, we can counter target spell. Its controller draws a card, and we will draw a card. Drown in the Lock. For a blue and a black, we can choose one. We can counter target spell with CMC less than or equal to the number of cards in the controller's graveyard, or destroy target creature with converted mana costs less than or equal to the number of cards in its controller's graveyard. For X and a blue, we can cast Urtai's Meddling. Whenever a target spell is successfully cast, we can put X delay counters on it, but X cannot be 0, meaning that the card will still technically be cast, but it will not resolve until all delay counters are removed from it. Helping out with some card draw, we have Intellectual Offering. We'll choose an opponent, and then you and that opponent will each draw 3 cards, and then we'll choose an opponent again, and then untap all non-land permanents that you and that player control. Jaded Response, we will counter target spell if it shares a color with a creature we control. If we have our commander out, that will mean we can counter a red, blue, or black spell. Memory Lapse, for some extra shenanigans, we can counter target spell, and then if it's countered, we will put it on the top of its owner's library instead of into the graveyard. A pretty fun defensive card in a pinch, Polymorphous Jest. Until end of turn, each creature target player controls lose all abilities and become blue frog creature tokens with base power and toughness 1/1. And for some target removal, we have Terminate. For a red and a black, we can destroy target creature, it can't be regenerated. For our sorceries, we have Burning Inquiry. Each player draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. Chart a Course. We will draw 2, and then we will discard a card unless we attacked with a creature this turn. Clear the Mind. Target player will shuffle their graveyard into their library and then draw a card. In the event we're drawing lots of cards and we have more than 7 cards in our hand, we will have to discard. Now, once our graveyard starts loading up and we want to get some of these cards back in our library, this is a great way to recycle some of those cards. Consult the Necrosagers. For 1, a blue and a black, we can choose one. Target player will draw 2, or target player will discard 2 cards. Do or Die. For 1 in the black, we will separate all creatures target player controls into 2 face-up piles. Then we will destroy all creatures in the pile of that player's choice. They can't be regenerated. So it's a great way to force an opponent to choose which creatures they would like to keep on the battlefield more. For a red and a black, we have Dreadbore. We can destroy target creature or planeswalker. A card that I just recently came across that will be helping us ramp is Inner Fire. For 3 and a red, we can add a red to our mana pool for each card in our hand. We have Life's Finale. For 4 and 2 black, we can destroy all creatures, then search target opponent's library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into his or her graveyard, and then that player will shuffle his or her library. We have Night's Whisper. We will draw 2 cards and then lose 2 life. A new card from M21, one that I knew I had to include, Peer into the Abyss. For 4 and 3 black, target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life. We will round up each time. This is a great way to just straight up laser an opponent if we are commander out on the battlefield. And for 4 and 2 blue, we can play River's Rebuke. We will return all non-land permanents target player controls to their owner's hands. We will be running 2 planeswalkers in this deck. First up is Ashiok Dreamrender. The passive ability reads, spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. The idea behind this is that our opponents won't be able to just tutor for an answer for some of our cards that may be causing trouble on the board. This means they'll be forced to dig for answers the old-fashioned way, thus taking damage every single time from our commander. And Obnixilis, the Hate Twisted, really has the same effect as our commander. Whenever an opponent draws a card, he will take 1 damage from Obnixilis, but we can also use the -2 to target remove certain creatures and then force that control to draw 2 cards as well. Last but not least are our lands. We are going to be running at 10 non-basic lands. Those include Cinder Barrens, Command Tower, Dragon Skull Summit, Drowned Catacomb, Evolving Wilds, Highland Lake, Myriad Landscape, Submerged Boneyard, Sulphur Falls, and Terramorphic Expanse. And for our basics, we have 9 mountains, 8 islands, and 8 swamps. And just like that, we have reached the end of another Commander deck tech. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe, tell your friends about us, and leave a comment down below. Let us know what commanders you would like to see us build around in the future. We really appreciate the support.